Hey everyone, I'm Jonathan Goss with the Gosslings. Give your inner Christian warrior something to really gravitate towards and feed upon with Heavenly Realms, a series of 7 novels about angelic warfare written by me, yours truly. It is masculine, warrior-based fiction that is biblically based, but is extremely gratifying for the warrior in all of you. It is available on Amazon in paperback, ebook, and audiobook. If you like it, leave a review. If you want signed copies, you can always email us at thegoslingsgroup@gmail.com, and I would really love to hear from you. Again, Heavenly Realms by Jonathan Goss, available on Amazon. Check it out. Take up the broken sword of your father
and strike down the darkness.
Amen. Greetings, everyone. I'm Jonathan.
And I'm Nick.
And we are the Gosslings, a digital speakeasy of free thinkers, Christian authors, explorers of the esoterica, and general purveyors of buffoonery.
That's right. We have an amazing interview and conversation for you. But if you would, first, it really helps us if you would take up the broken sword of your finger, strike down that subscribe button, and while you're down there, tinkle that bell.
Yeah, give that bell a gentle caress, or keep your YouTube pin pan strong and smack that bell. Smack it like it owes you money.
That's right. And if you've already done those things, well, first of all, thank you. But also, if you hit the like button, that would really help us because it shows the algorithm that you like this video and other people who have shared interest will also like it. That would help tremendously.
Yeah, that's right. Leave a comment, share it with your friends, send it to your enemies, do all the things.
That's right.
Who cares?
Who cares? And without further ado, here is this video's conversation and interview. We hope you guys enjoy it.
That's right. Vertical punch.
Your YouTube feed is crap. Stop wasting your time watching bot-boosted shills and self-appointed gurus cloying for your attention. Instead, join the Gosslings interview live stream and podcast. The Gosslings, a dark-lit digital speakeasy of free thinkers. A super chat of radical truth-seeking wizards who eat trolls for second breakfast. Topics that'll make your mama's hair stand on end. Ideas that'll make your pastor's knees knock. Guests that will illuminate the hidden chambers of your mind. And interviews that strike down the darkness. Welcome to the Gosslings.
Gary Wayne, author of the Genesis 6 Conspiracy, author of the sequel, Genesis 6 Conspiracy Part 2, which is on pre-order now on Amazon, comes out in March, so you can go to Amazon right now and get it on pre-order. We don't have a copy, so we kind of made our own that you can see back here. It just says Part 2 right there, so we're very pleased with that. And in order to maximize our time, first of all, we want to thank you, Gary, for being here. We just had probably, a 45-hour-long conversation for our Patreon. So welcome back to the Goslings for another round, and we're very happy to have you. Gary, before we get started real quick, how you doing, my friend?
Doing very well, and I want to thank you for promoting book 2. It's a spectacular looking cover there in the background. So
the only reason we don't have a copy is because it's not available to buy
yet. It's not printed yet. So
that's why we don't have it.
I admire your ingenuity on this, and so and then I'll also say there's a wonderful cover up on Amazon, but that's not going to be that cover. So it was changed last week, so it's more of a goldish color that's on Amazon. So the one that I sent you yesterday is going to be the new cover. I'm hoping to get a better HD picture of that to get it up on my website. So
nice.
I don't have, just so people know, I don't have a pre-booking availability on it yet, but it will be up soon. I've got the book on the site still with the old cover, for Part 2. It hasn't even been published, and it's the old cover. And I also have a generous excerpt of all 84 chapters up on the website right now. And so people can get a good feel for it, and the table of contents that obviously goes with that. So you get a good feel of the book and the table of contents. And I will be getting, as soon as now that I have the information out as soon as I know exactly when I might get a printed copy, and I think I'll get it sooner. I will get a notification out to everybody on the list who sent in emails to me wanting to be notified. I will get that out. We have a March 12th release date, but that's only because there's a shortage of paper right now. There's a shortage of labor and a shortage of printers, with the large companies buying up all of the smaller printers, that there's a bottleneck, and you cannot miss your publish date. As a
Yep.
publisher. If you do, then they punish you big time. And that's just, for me, if the publisher, they do a lot of books, but so that's a safe date. But once they get it printed, I'll get my books, and and once I have that date that I can sort of rely on, I'll get that notification out to everybody. In the meantime, though, I will have, probably before I get that notification out, I should have, because I got the website guy working on the website right now, obviously, to have that pre-booking capability, and there'll be bundling in there as well.
Will we be able to order signed author copies from your
Yes.
website like we did last time?
Yes,
Nice.
on the same website. And you can buy a mixed match of the books in different quantities. So if people wanted to get another book and one of the new book, then there's a discount for that, and all that represents is basically the difference in savings on freight.
Oh, dude, I'm in.
That's
I can
excellent.
I can already think of like 2 or 3 people I need to get your first book for, and I definitely need to get a couple of copies of your second book, one for me and one for Nick.
Yeah.
So you're going to be having a chunk of change coming your way from me in about 6 months,
Yeah.
Gary.
Well, and you can read the book independently of each other. So
yeah.
there's some overlap, but I didn't want it to be redundant. So only what needs to be there. So, but I think each book will lead you to want to read the other book because the information dovetails.
Yeah, they seem to complement each other nicely, just judging from the table of contents that we read. And Nick made the astute observation that you focus more on the giants, it seems like, in this one.
In scripture.
Yeah,
You specifically mentioned in scripture.
With
With the communication from the audience through my email, through the website, or on social media, or taking questions on shows, is people really liked the first book, but and it did exactly what I wanted to, which sort of permitted me, I think, to write this book. I think it would need that first book, as controversial as it is, because I'm trying to hit a number of audiences and all the different things it talks about. It opened the door, I think, to write this one that I said I would never write, because I didn't want to be redundant. I am 300 pages into another book, so I wanted to finish that, and I stopped that. But what I was hearing was there's this incredible thirst for knowledge about what's in the Bible about prehistory, and in a way that would be way more than what I presented. And I present a fair bit of information in the first book, and they wanted it specifically targeted at themselves, and in a way that they have an ability to go to the sourcing and can make an argument for others from that book. And so this book, it's as unique as the first book, but in a different way, and specifically targeted for Christians, and goes through more things in the Bible in terms of giants, angels, demons, and the giant wars and the different kinds of giant nations that are out there than anything that's on the book. And all the time I'm highlighting information and key words that define end time prophecy, because to fully understand end time prophecy is what I like to tell people as often as I can. You need to understand prehistory. And then I roll that into a larger prophetic end than I do in the first book, and actually lay down my chronology through using my approach, which I give people in the preface so that they can understand how I come about my sort of point of view. And then you can test it against what it says in the Bible, because the approach ought to be nothing conflicts with each other. And don't leave out inconvenient passages. So you can't do it all, but you can show enough to show how you can slide all the other pieces into it that, I may not have referenced, but there's like 4,000 endnotes in this book.
Oh my gosh.
Awesome.
And they're not in the end now, they're footnotes. They're going to be on the same page.
Smart move. Yeah.
Because there's so much information that's in the footnotes that people can look at what's said and then look down. And then in the first book, where I utilized particularly for stuff outside the Bible, I used sources that referenced other sources. So because I wanted the spurious forces talking in their own words. I didn't want to have people think I was manipulating. I go directly to the sources this time.
Nice.
Awesome.
Very
Man.
cool.
It's
Very
a tall
cool.
order, but we're super excited to see what you've done with it.
And when it's live, when after publication date too, we
Yeah.
of course would love to have you back so we can, have a copy here so everyone can see it and continue to help direct people to it.
Yeah, and maybe the Kindle version will be out sooner because it's already there. They can do that anytime that they want. But they control Kindle, so Amazon does. So they'll release that when they choose. But hopefully that part will be available before March, and hopefully the book is printed before March, which it should be because it's such a safe date that's put out there not to miss the deadline, and that Amazon will decide to start selling it sooner.
Nice. Well, one of our Patreon questions from our patron America in Cars wanted us to ask you. He said, Gary, I'm seeing an uptick in cryptid videos on shows such as Paranormal TV, etc., things such as the San Francisco Crawler and Rake like beings. In your opinion, are these demonic or a class of fallen angels, as angel is just a descriptor?
Well, I think we have to make some distinctions. So when we have an angelic being or a god, as it's known in polytheism, they have ability to take a physical form in the physical world. And seemingly they can take a physical form of their choice, whether it's male or female, as with gods and goddesses in the pantheons. And in a lot of cases where you have, let's say like Zeus, for example, who would appear as a wolf. So ability to take all sorts of different shapes. So we have to be open to the fact that they may take some shapes that aren't their normal sort of godlike shape. I don't think that's the large proportion. They may do that to try and create a larger illusion on how many kinds of aliens there are and where they come from.
Right. Yeah.
But if we look at prehistory, and particularly in polytheism, they create a lot of beings, the gods do, whether it's the little people, whether or not and they're part of the elementals, which are 3 groups of little people, all sorts of different names, same 3 groups all around the world. But there's also a 4th group called the salamanders, which are reptilian type beings, and they're taller than humans, and they're different than the Nephilim. They may be survivors of the hash or the serpent. If they were able to ensure that giants survived the flood, they would ensure other creatures that they created would survive the flood, or there was all recreated in the second incursion again. Just as they did before the flood. You could get there anyway. And so these depictions start to get into all sorts of different types of beings that they created, including the chimera being, which is part of science today that they're doing. So like King Hababa, he's not only a giant, but he's got multiple parts to him. So he's I won't go into some of the graphic details of what some of his
We
parts
get you.
are.
You can use your imagination.
No, we
Yes,
get
so
it.
look it up. And so he's the king of the Cedar Forest, which is Mount Hermon. And then what's also interesting in the Epic of Gilgamesh and whether it's the legends of Idzubar or other ones, they're all telling the same story. It's the same legend. You've got Enkidu and Gilgamesh, which is 2/3 god and 1/3 human, just as Upnapishtim and everybody on the ark is in their flood story, which is kind of interesting. You would think a mix is a 50-50 mix. But is there something else going on there that it's 1/3 human, 2/3 God? And how many times could they split that and still have a created sexual being, from a copulation? So I think that when we're looking at the visible ones, which include originally the Nephilim and today their descendants who run the Royals, who run the Masonic organizations, you also have a hierarchy within the visible ones. So I would probably put the Nephilim and the Rephaim, at the top of the visible ones. And you might put, if the Nahash serpent, there were survivors of that, I would put that right below. And then the salamanders in that hierarchy of the elementals is higher than the little ones. So then how many others did they create that would sort of be fitting in there? And so we don't know how many different creations were talked about in prehistory is real, and how many of those would be created afterwards. So, and if we're getting closer to the end time, you might see more of that incursion type of happening again, and maybe even the creation of new giants as well. But and I would separate it into two different groups. Ones that sort of follow into a copulation reproduction, and one that would be more scientific, DNA altering, gene altering, those types of things, as with the chimera understanding with science today. And I think we see that, throughout prehistory.
It's funny because just I think it was last night I was over at my friend's house and we were watching we're big movie fans. We like John Carpenter. My favorite's In the Mouth of Madness. His favorite is The Thing. And he was showing me this clip of this guy who was talking about like the reason why people can't go to Antarctica is because of the giant spiders that they've unearthed,
Oh yeah. Yeah.
like these pictures of it's
Yeah.
kind of silly, on the surface, but then like you think about it, it's like, I mean, with Nephilim creations, like why wouldn't there be a race of, giant hybrid spider monster things that have been frozen,
Yeah, we have no
antediluvian.
idea how far that got, and then again how far it might have gotten after the flood, or did they protect them in places like Antarctica? Did they protect them in another dimension off the earth somehow, some way from the flood to ensure that they would survive? We don't really know any of that. I think it all fits better in all being recreated after the flood. And then those angels would go to the abyss as well. So, for example, Baal and Ashtaroth and the Baalim created Rephaim after the flood, according to the Ugaritic texts. So if they did that, then that explains why sometime shortly after the flood, those gods disappear. And then all the other angels that didn't do those same violations but were rebellious and part of the Saba or the host of the rebellious ones would just move up, because Saba for host of heaven is an army of angels, and they have a army of angels that's at least 33 million or 50 million, depending on how you calculate 1/3 from 10,000 times 10,000, which is 100 million. And in other verses, they're uncountable, the amount of angels. So there's a lot of rebellious angels.
Gary, you mentioned the Ugaritic text. Can you tell people what that is and why it's so important to your research?
Well, yeah, the Ugaritic text is written in original Semitic after the flood, and that's part of the root language for Hebrew. So a lot of the Hebrew words will go back to a vowelless Hebrew, back to a vowelless Semitic. So vowelless Semitic for Rephaim is RPM. So R, P, and an M. And sometimes that, as you go back further in the Hebrew language and Semitic language, it's that PH isn't an F sound, it's just a hard P sound. So where you get the word Naphalim is some of the versions, that's sort of relying more by inserting the vowels, but using the old phonetic hard P and not into an F sound. So that's one thing to keep in mind. The other thing to keep in mind is it talks about the Baalim and the assembly of gods in the Ugaritic text. And it talks about the parent god that was before the flood, El. And it's these Baalim that are creating their Rapiu or the Rapiem or RPM in original Semitic after the flood. And then the fertility rituals that they do in the Ugaritic texts, they're trying to bring back Baal and Ashtaroth, who have somehow disappeared mysteriously because they're in the abyss for the crimes that they did, that they want to have them come back to create more Rephaim because they have a fertility issue. Go ahead.
Is that is that what happens in I can't remember if it's Leviticus or Numbers or Exodus or Numbers, but the children of Israel are in the wilderness. They have the tabernacle set up, and they catch some Israelites. They're guilty of worshiping Baal Peor directly in front of the tabernacle, which is a sexual ritual. Is that what they were trying to do in that account?
Yeah, there's two kinds of sexual rituals. One is done to try and recreate sort of divine ones within the bloodline and all of that sort of initiation. But there's also ones where they want to bring the gods back to create the new ones. I suspect over time they stop doing that because they don't come back, right?
Yeah.
So, but it's important to understand. And so you get a lot of the nations that are talked about in the Bible, let alone the Baalim gods, that are talked about in the Ugaritic text. And the city of Ugarit is located between Mount Hermon and Tyre, which is really important to understand part of the geography of that period and things I talk about in the book. Now, that word Ugarit is very, very interesting as it relates back to the Bible. Not only including the Rephaim, and the Rephaim are talked about as kings, giants, warriors, and healers, and they can heal themselves and heal others, and somehow have this fertility issue. So Rapha 7495, singular for Rephaim, means healer or doctor. So if it's like Raphael, it means healer of God or God heals, right?
Yep.
Okay.
Jehovah Rapha, Rapha, God our healer.
Yeah, and one of the variations of the titles and names of Baal that I put in the new book is I'll give about 3 or 4 different versions that just as Satan has more names and titles, let's say like, Halel and Gadrael is in the book of Enoch. Halel being the one in Isaiah 14:12 where King James says Lucifer, the Hebrew word is Halel, and angels' names end in El. So probably should have been transferred just like Michael was transferred over, not the meaning, or Gabriel. So you have a root God name as one of the titles that's eponymous for the Rephaim tribe, right? And you've got many giant tribes talked about in the Ugaritic text that are part of the assembly of the Datanu, which is the same as the Tuatha De Danann. And I walked through that in the book as well. And that and 7495 is healer, 7496 means evil spirit or a shed or a demon, words like that, which again is the disembodied spirits of the giants. And 7497 is the word for giant that shows up 25 times in the Old Testament, just as Rephaim show up as a tribe, going back to Rapha 7497, Genesis 14, and Genesis 16. So important to understand these cross links over as they link over into the Bible. And these were known just as Gilgamesh, in the Gilgamesh story, King Hababa, who we talked about, and it has a few different transliterations of that name. He's the terrible one as commissioned by the gods, terrible one to humans. Terrible one shows up in Isaiah 14, Ezekiel 32, and other places. Isaiah 25 is another great place to look at the branch of the terrible ones. You have that word being used to describe these evil spirits that are in the sides of the abyss in cells, talking to Pharaoh, who's another Raphaim bloodline descendant and a terrible one as well. And these ones in the abyss are the terrible ones who did terrible things while on earth and were killed and slain and were sent to the abyss. And I cover off why that's such a terrible death in the new book as well. But to shorten the story to where I'm getting at, that's the Hebrew word arit, A-R-I-Y-T. And it means, several things that are associated with giants, but two interesting parts to the many nuances to the name is that they were infertile and childless. And I think it wasn't from a sperm issue. I think it was the females had difficulty reproducing, and they were very, very few. There were some, and they were used and valuable to start new dynasties. They're that well appreciated. So when Timnah, as we talked about in the first part of the show, I think, and Eliphaz marry, Eliphaz is son of Esau, who lost all his birthrights, blessings, and messianic promises to Jacob through and into Israel. They're trying to wipe Israel from the face of the earth. And you have that bloodline coming from Abraham that's intermarrying with the Horim giants. Timnah is the daughter of Seir as part of the Dukes of Seir in Genesis 36, and they start this new hybrid dynasty, very highly valued sort of dynasty. And they had plans with this dynasty because of some of the fertility issues. If they're going to not become extinct, they're going to have to intermarry with humans and dilute their bloodlines over time. Now, what's interesting about that word arit, look at the word ugarit. So you take the UG off, you have A-R-I-T. Put the I-am male plural on would be terrible ones. So this is the city of terrible ones. It would be Kiryat Ugarit, and that first part of the syllable is UG, Ug. Now, if you take King Og, who was king of Edrei and Ashtaroth at Mount Hermon, those cities are mentioned in the Ugaritic text, and he's the last of the Raphaim.
Wow.
Last of the giants, going back to Raphaim.
King Og is.
Yeah. And that word for Og would be spelled O-W-G as we transliterate that into English, and it can mean long neck and a few other things, but it's the title name for King Og. And it goes back to a Hebrew word, Ug, U-W-G, which means round or wide, just as the giants had a 2-to-1 height to width ratio, similar to Og's bed, because they weren't fat as in stout. That was just the word that's used throughout the Old Testament. I cover that off in detail in the new book. And so this is, and that would go back to the Semitic vowelist, because the W is kind of inserted for the sound there, would be just UG, which is now the first syllable for Ugarit. And so Ugarit would be the city of Og, the terrible one, who moves back to Mount Hermon after the Rephaim tribes are basically wiped out in the War of Giants in Genesis 14. And then becomes king over the Amorites as they show up in the flood, which sort of says that city of Ugarit was the original royal city of King Og.
Wow.
So those connections we can tie right into the Bible. So I do use the Ugaritic text and show these things. And so when it's talking about the assembly of gods at Mount Saphon, which is, and understand Hermon has many names, Saphon in the Ugaritic text, the Bible has Sion, Sirion, and maybe a couple others in there as well, known by different peoples. And that's referencing this assembly of the gods in Psalm 82.
Are you looking to actualize your inner Leonidas? Are you looking to find something for the Spartan in your life? Look no farther than Jardani Jovanovic. Jardani Jovanovic hair and skincare products made by real men for real men. Or as I like to say, be as sexy as you are deadly, give 007 a run for his money, awaken your inner John Wick with Jardani Jovanovic. Hair and skincare products.
Yeah, I love how it's all connected. So, Timnah and Elihaz, is that right? He is the son of Esau,
Yes.
and they create this hybrid dynasty.
Yep.
And Esau, it says he was red and hairy.
Ruddy.
Is this where we get the mythos of the red-haired giants?
No, I think that's a specific description of Esau, and he is obviously different than his twin, so they're not identical twins. That doesn't mean there's any Nephilim trait in there. You have this fair skin and this sort of whitish, pinkish color, and red hair, and some blonde hair as it mixes in with the mostly red hair as opposed to the blonde, but there's a little bit of blonde in there. That would be part of the traits. And so when you see, David was ruddy as well.
Yeah.
And fair. And King Saul was fair. And again, they might have a similar look, but they don't have that same DNA, and they're not of the same sort of size.
So was
but
Alexander the Great. It was a very interesting
Well,
thing.
now he has those bloodlines that goes back to giants. So yeah, so if you look in the giants within the covenant land, and I cover this off in the new book as well, is the Horim, and had very pale skin, just as that name goes back to white, blanche, and words associated like white bread of the similar spelling, and they had red hair. Now, when we're talking about pale white, we're not talking about ruddy. I mean, we're talking about deathly white, even whiter than me, skin, if that
Me
were
too.
possible.
Me too.
Yeah. And so this is something that's different than the ruddy, which is the white reddish sort of tinge to it. But they had red hair and pale skin. The Anakim were blonde haired and blue eyed, and hazel eyes were the Hori. And so part of the Datanu tribes of the assembly, part of the Tuatha Dudanan, the tribe of Anu, part of the Raphaim, these are different names, and I'll connect them together just as I did in the first book, but this time a little bit differently, because I wanted to get into more unique points about the reliability of understanding that sort of connection. But the Amorites, which are a hybrid branch, like the Amalekites, do not have a patriarch in Genesis 10 or First Chronicles. There are 9 tribes that are patriarchless, and they are blonde hair and blue-eyed and pale skin, and would be, let's say, I think probably because of affiliation and where they lived, likely offspring of the Anakim, of the same traits, only just a little bit smaller.
That was going to be one of my questions about the Anakim and why it was significant that they were patriarchless.
Because you do not get any Rephaim patriarchs listed in the table of nations. You have 70 nations that are listed, only 9 are patriarchless. So what that means is all of the patriarchs listed, including Nimrod, have a father that you can trace to a human.
A terrestrial human father. So the
Yeah.
9 without a patriarch have direct ties to Nephilim, fallen angels, Gregory Watchers.
So that name Rapha, which is eponymous for the Raphaim, is also understood by a lot of scholars, and it makes a whole lot of sense that it could be patronymic as well as the patriarch for which was named eponymously after the Rephaim tribe. Even though all the tribes can be considered Rephaim, might have been the first tribe that was, let's say, created and maybe connected closer to Raphael, or I mean, Baal, with those Raphael-like names, being from the first creator, just as they're called the Raphaim or the Rapium, the Rapiu in the Ugaritic text. But you get other giant nations in there as well that are part of the Datanu assembly of giants at Mount Hermon. So when you have this patriarch that you can go back to as a Rapha, he's not in the Table of Nations. Rephaim patriarchs, Rephaim are not in the Table of Nations. They show up out of nowhere, and they're not part of that 70 nations. And we have another one, and everybody says, well, yes, you've got verses, and it looks like that's a patriarch, but do you got anything else? And I'm going, well, yeah, we do. We got Arba. And so Arba is listed in the book of Joshua as not only the greatest Anakim, but the patriarch for the Anakim tribe, which is described as giants, which is, again, from the generic term Rapha, Raphaim, as Deuteronomy lists the Anakim as giants, Rapha, Raphaim, versus Nephilim, which is, again, a significant nuance that I highlight in the new book. And I'm talking mostly about the Raphaim, the post-Diluvian giants in the new book, and as it relates to the Bible. And so you have Arba, who's the father of the Anakim, and he's not listed in the Table of Nations. And so we need to understand that when you get patriarchless nations like the Amorites, they're not in the Table of Nations. And the accounting of Timnah and Eliphaz is not in the Table of Nations. It's in Genesis 36 to help make sense of the history, but not part of the Table of Nations. And a different accounting in the First Chronicles as well. So you have this separate sort of insertion to explain some of the things that you need to understand what's going on in the covenant land of that time. So you can actually trace the names of the patriarchless Canaanites back to a Rephaim patriarch. And I do that in this book, and you can do it through a variety of ways, of cities that are named after them, locations. You can use the Ugaritic text to make some of those associations, some of the gods that are used in association with them. And I'll provide what I think is the patriarchal name as it would have been understood as the Rephaim. And I'm going to talk about nations that people don't even identify with as Rephaim or giant nations. So if you get, for example, like the Makathim or the Makathites, as they're listed in the Bible, they don't have a patriarch in the Table of Nations. So who's that patriarch? These are giant nations. Or the Kenites, that I will make a distinguish between the hybrids and the Kenim, and you get the Kenim listed with the Cadmonim and the Kenazim in the mighty 10 of Genesis 15, of the land that is going to be given to Abraham, of people, giant nations and hybrids that are occupying it. And in the mighty 7, you also have part of the Rephaim that are in there as well, listed as Rephaim. You don't have patriarchs for these. And a lot of people say, well, you've got like Kenaz, who shows up in Genesis 36, hundreds of years afterwards. So again, like the Amalekites showing up in Genesis 14 before Genesis 36, when the Amalekite nation is a new nation created between Timnah and Eliphaz, you got this nation of giants that comes out of nowhere without a patriarch who, and I'll go through all of these patriarchless nations and the giant nations and take that back to what I think is the patriarch that provided the eponymous name for the tribe.
Man,
that one was
awesome.
Makkah. Makkah is the giant name for the Makkathim.
Man, that's awesome. No wonder it took you so long to get your book out. You're doing all this research. This is fantastic.
It goes deeper than anything that's out there.
I love how
There's
you
not-
can just reference these things so quickly. Like you're like an encyclopedia, really. I mean, your work is just so dense, but you're so comfortable just referencing all
You're
of
like
these
a
things.
biblical mentat. It's pretty awesome.
Yeah, yeah, I
Gary,
can admit that.
I'm gonna
I have a
to look
question.
that word up.
Oh, it's from
I'm
Dune.
just kidding. Just
It's from the
kidding.
movie
Yeah.
Dune.
Yeah.
You know, the
Yeah.
human
Yeah.
supercomputers. Yeah.
Yeah.
Which I still haven't watched.
Yeah, Nick still
Yeah.
hasn't seen it. You
Yeah.
know.
Yeah.
So I want to
well,
ask you.
well,
Oh, go ahead.
it helps to have a good memory, but there's so much. If you can't, you have to find a way to remember and to be able to make sense of things. Otherwise, some people may think I'm a lunatic anyways, but I try and present it in a way that makes sense and you connect the dots and people can understand. And it's important to understand that Makkah theme connection as it comes down to the time of King David, when Absalom is born from a wife that David takes from the Gesherim, which is another tribe of giants that I cover in the book. And his wife's name is Makkah. So it's patriarchal and it's matriarchal in the bloodline. And so you have this giant from the daughter of King Talmai, again, a title name of a kingship title of Talmai, one of the three Anakim kings that were listed in the time of the Exodus and at Hebron, produces, a bloodline daughter who's going to marry David, who's going to produce Absalom. And what does Absalom do once he gets in trouble for killing his brother for probably good reasons? He goes to Gesher for protection from King Talmai, and then they plot the overthrow of Israel, and he starts a rebellion, and that would put a hybrid bloodline on the Israelite throne before Jesus is even born. And David is just starting out on setting up that bloodline through Solomon down to Jesus. It is designed to make sure that humankind do not reach their destiny. And this is a theme that we need to understand. And it's all there for us in the Bible if you look for it and you understand who the players are.
Yeah. You understand the players by understanding their history, their bloodlines, their ancestry.
Yeah.
Oh man, that's really interesting.
And how things are recorded about them. So
can I change gears just briefly and ask you one of our patrons' questions?
yes.
It's a little more relevant to current events. This is from, I believe it's Dread. Is that right?
I think so. It's
Yeah.
DREHD. So I imagine he's probably going for a dread thing.
Probably.
That's what I like to think, anyways.
He says
He is the law.
he says question for Gary. Is the Gog and Magog in the Ezekiel 38 war the same Gog and Magog in Revelation 27? I personally think it is the people of Russia, since they are currently the only country in the world that has built nuclear bunkers large enough to shelter a huge portion of their population, thereby allowing a large number of their citizens to survive the Great Tribulation alive and well make it through to the millennium.
Yeah, I think it happens at two different periods. I think there's probably a remnant of Gog and Magog descendants at the end, although it could be, because it's 1,000 years and a little bit more after the war in Ezekiel 38 and 39, that it could be more representative of Gentile nations as a whole, of people who survived into the millennium, who rebel and being led by Satan. But I mean, it's choosing the word Gog and Magog for a reason, and for us to sort of dig a little bit deeper into it. So we know the Gog and Magog war is in the end time, not the end of the millennium, because there's two chronological markers in there for us. So in Ezekiel 38, it says in the latter days, and latter days is one of the terms for the end time. Okay, not the end of the millennium. And that this is when Israel is settled in the nation, but they're not magnified to being the great nation they will be in the millennium. So there's a huge distinction on Israel's position living in Jerusalem as the chosen people, and the rewards for all that they have gone through that comes with that being them being reconciled back into the Holy Covenant in the last 3.5 years of this age. And so you have another marker. So I think that's one that we can use, but fortunately there's another one, because I can see how you can conflate the two. Then it really starts to make end time chronology and millennium chronology change completely. So in Ezekiel 39, after this war it has been fought, and after the burying of the bodies, you have second Exodus, which happens in the last 3.5 years. It happens in the year of the Lord's favor, before the year of the Lord's wrath. And I won't go through significant detail on how to get there, but understand that all the passages, in my opinion, and how I put prophecy together, it lends it to believe that that's the time of Jacob's trouble, Hebrew Sarah, cognate for, and also meaning tribulation, affliction, persecution, is the same cognate word for thlipses in the time of the great tribulation of the last 3.5 years, and after Michael stands. And Sarah is the time of trouble used in Daniel 12, as it goes back to Hebrew Sarah as well, and a whole bunch more. So we have two end time, last 7-year markers when that war is going to take place. So two different wars. And what's interesting about Gog is two things. One, if you take that back to Greek and Hebrew, it means an end-time Antichrist figure as part of its meaning. So one that's named so that maybe it might be helpful for us in the end time, because Antichrist is going to need another Antichrist that he can claim is the Antichrist, so that Antichrist can claim himself as the true Messiah, right? Because he's has an Armageddon war, he has an Antichrist figure, and he needs to fulfill the Messiah credentials. So then, we don't have in the Bible any form of genealogy for Gog. He does not show up in the table of nations as a nation. He's Gog of Magog, chief prince of Meshech. Well, that's really kind of interesting, but we do get Magog that shows up in the table of nations.
Yeah.
So now it's getting kind of interesting. And so Magog, I think, and a number of the Japheth descendants, they're migrating into the Scythia region and the mountain areas where the giants, the Rephaim, are populating and come down and settle in the covenant land before the Tower of Babel and into Samaria and before the Tower of Babel, and they're the Aboriginals. So you have them intermarrying with these Asia Minor giants. And I think so much so that they either change their names themselves to be named after the people that they're intermarrying into, or biblical writers will change their names to sort of reflect that. So why would I say something like that, other than that we know from earlier that we're talking about that there's going to be these hybrid nations that are created because the Rephaim have this fertility issue. And I think Nimrod marries into female giants to create dynasties that come from him that reflect through the Sumerian region. So in partnership with those Mesopotamian giants, which are a little bit different for the most part than the covenant land ones. But to finish my point on this, and then I'll let you back in as quick as I can for that question. I just want to finish this off. There is a parent god before the flood who has offspring, and he marries Clydo, either Clydo or Clymene. Because Poseidon is related to one of those two. The names are very, very similar. Poseidon is the offspring god who takes over for Iapetus. Iapetus is the original parent god of the sea. He's like Kronos. And Poseidon would be equivalent with Zeus and Baal, offspring gods after the flood. And they inherit the mythos and the legend of the parent god. Iapetus produces 3 giants that are named in prehistory, named Albion, Gog, and Magog. Now, what's common after the flood is giants are named after giants before the flood. So Gilgamesh, for example, is sixth generation after the flood, son of Lugalbanda and a goddess, a fertility goddess named Nin, and is produced as a second incursion one, as is Enkidu. And you have a Gilgamesh that appears in the Enochian Book of Giants before the flood, talking to Enoch, trying to figure out how to prevent the flood, and is actually going to war against some of the gods because he doesn't want to have this flood. He's so upset. So it's common. So like Hercules is probably named after a giant before the flood named Hercules, which they conflate as one. So this is a common thing if you start to look at it, and it helps you to sort prehistory if you understand parent gods ruled before the flood, offspring gods after the flood, and they both create giants. All topics I cover off in the new book. So I think not only is Magog named after these giants, you have god names and kingship titles within polytheist nations after. And it's a title of these giant kings in a number of areas in the Middle East, into the Syrian region, into Asia Minor, and into Greece. So what do I think is going on here? I think that this is a reference to bloodlines of giants, and in a war that happens after the opening of the abyss. And that you have some of these terrible ones that are going to be coming out of the abyss, and some of them may have an oikotarian or a dwelling place for their spirit that are going to be active in the 10 king end time empire after they're released. And Gog may be a reference to that because of it, an odd positioning of a name that has no genealogical record other than he's Gog of Magog, chief prince of Meshech. And if you look at the migrations of some of the Indo-Aryan groups, and there's 4 or 5 depending on the historian that you talk about, one of the group of the Scythians moves into the Ukraine and sets up the original czars as part of the Tartarian sort of empire that the Mongols are part of. And then another branch moves into Moscow of the Putyanin bloodline with Vladimir the Great, and rules there as part of that Rurikud Kievan czarship until about 1600s, where there's an intermarriage by the Romanovs as a junior offshoot, just like the Plantagenets are a junior offshoot of the Anjou and the bloodline systems of other Europeans. And that the city of Moscow, and I won't go down the Putin line right now, but the city of Moscow takes its etymological root back to Meshech. So now you have Gog of Magog, chief prince of Meshech, as the leader of this alliance. And so you can make connections to other people that are in that alliance, and we can go there if people want. But I just wanted to add that another reason why I think that this is before the midpoint is it's part of the 10 king empire that I referenced that is going to be in place in, before Antichrist rise to power, and in place as the 7th empire. And I think it's the Babylonian connection that allows that to come about through some of the sorrows. And so you have this war that's happening after the 10 kings. There's going to be some sort of split, and that because of the timing in the latter days and before the second Exodus, and I think, as I said, there's a connection to after the opening of the abyss, which is just before the midpoint, say 6 months to a year and a half, somewhere in that sort of zone. And you have another war that's in Revelation 9 that happens after the scorpion beings come out, and they're like this chimera type of army. And these are the same creatures that are described in Joel 1 and 2. And I put those descriptions upside by each, so to speak, in the new book so that people can see how they're the same. And this is a war that happens before Armageddon, because Armageddon, the day of the Lord, happens in Joel 3. So now it lines up with the timing of the Gog War, the opening of the Abyss, and the Revelation 9 War, and the counterfeit Armageddon Antichrist is going to need to claim that he defeated the Antichrist, and then he moves his armies into Jerusalem. So some of the connections that you start to make through that. So yeah, I think they're two different wars. They may have a connection on the peoples, but there's also this connection we have to understand coming out of prehistory.
That was a great answer. That was a great answer. It's funny because I never really thought about the parent gods having offspring before the flood, and then the offspring gods, being responsible for a second incursion.
Yeah.
I always thought it was just somehow the bloodline of the pre-flood or prehistory gods somehow made its way through one of the wives of Noah's sons.
Yeah, and that's one of the possible ways that people like to explain that. And we don't have necessarily a smoking gun verse as to how giants show up after the flood. So
Yeah.
I try not to get too dogmatic. Of the options on how they show up after the flood, that's kind of my least favorite. But you can't dismiss it. So the thing is what's going on. One of the things we have to understand is on the 8, if there's going to be mixed genetics in terms of how these are going to show up through Canaan, as the general theory sort of goes downstream with genes, then how many genes can you intermix in there to create the 4 races and the giants?
A good point. Yeah.
If you have 8 people and you have 4 races and 4 wives, and we know the lineage of Noah and his sons come from one specific lineage, then that would suggest one of those wives, perhaps Noah's, is the same lineage as Noah is, but you could have 3 wives from the other 3 races. But how do you now mix that in with gene pool? And why would you have corrupted DNA to start the world anew again? God already knew giants would show up after the flood. He's Alpha Omega. He already knew how they were going to do it. So why would you even need that? And so,
good point. That's a good point.
Yeah. And so I think what happens with Canaan is he receives that curse of the Ham's curse after the flood, and he's not going to be reserved for the punishment of his father and be subservient as a slave nation. And when his response to it is he's going to produce daughters that he's going to supply up, probably at the time up, before Babel, where he's going to supply humans to the fallen angels, in this case, from a biblical perspective, the Baalim, who move up to produce the Rephaim giants after the flood.
Yeah.
And that's why you have these patriarchless Canaanite tribes. And you only have 3 that are listed: Canaan, Heth, and Sidon. And Canaan becomes a hybrid giant nation as well. Heth becomes a hybrid nation, and so does Sidon. So I think what happens is you have them intermarrying with either female giants, or their daughters are continuing to intermarry with fallen angels. But because their name follows patronymically and their tribes are eponymously named, I'm thinking that they're intermarrying with female Rephaim to create hybrids in those 3 tribes as well that are going to dominate the descendants moving forward.
Do you have time for 2 more questions?
Sure.
Okay. I want to start with this one, and then we'll tie off with that.
Are we not doing these 2 because these came in late?
We'll see.
Yeah.
We'll see. We'll see.
Okay, well, let's try
These,
and get them all in the next 20 minutes. How's that?
yeah,
Okay.
we'll try.
I'll
Well,
have shorter answers.
if
5 minutes a question.
if
Start
that's
the
the
timer.
case,
Ding.
if that's the case, I definitely want to start with this one because this is relevant to his book.
Okay. Yeah, absolutely. I know that's the funny thing. I know.
I want to
Yeah.
keep it on track and keep it about Gary's book as much as we can. Both of these questions are,
And it's all relevant, but we do have very specific questions about the book.
what is there's a chapter of your new book titled the Philistine Military Complex
Yeah.
in relation to the Rephaim War against the Israelites in Canaan. What is the Philistine Military Complex?
Well, I described them earlier and I think in the first part of the show, that Philistines were kind of the nemesis of Israel, probably one of, the most powerful nation over hundreds of years against Israel. And they expropriated the land after leaving Crete and islands of the Mediterranean with other giant nations, and they were hybrids. And that the general thought is they pushed the Anakim and the Avim out and other giants, and they certainly would have had wars, but they accepted them into the Pentapolis of the Philistines. So you have like the Anakim who kept on Gath and Ashdod. You can find that in Joshua 11:22, or Gaza was kept by the Avim. That's Judges 6:12, and it's part of the mix. And the Philistines got Ashdod and Ekron. Now, there was an evolving state after the War of Giants, where the Mesopotamian giants came in and basically laid a whooping on pretty much all of the covenant land giants, trying to bring the hybrid Canaanites from the Sodom area back into a vassal state status. The other giants were protecting the Canaanites. So they started to build these big city-state fortresses. Now, what the Philistines do is they add to that, and they start to do a network of villages, walled villages and major cities, and they're like satellites all working in this military complex that was both used for offensive and defensive, and became the most powerful for hundreds of years system that was in place. And so it's sort of reflected in the story of the Ark and how they're trying to make good with God after returning the Ark, because they get all of these sores and things. And not only do they create a resemblance out of gold on the to represent the tumors, but they're also were referred to as mice, and the mice of the cities. And the mice is you take that back into Hebrew, is going to talk about this web and this complex, and it's referring to these walled villages. And these are even more advanced than what Og's were, where he had the Perazim, who were in all unwalled villages working in the same support. And Og had 12 Pentapolis, 60 cities, all with these Perazim working with unwalled villages. So the Philistines took it to even another level. And so I walked through that whole sort of complex, so what David and Saul were up, and all the people in the days of the judges were up against when they were waging wars against the Philistines.
Wow. Yeah. Wow. It's so crazy to me that the giants were known for their, epic levels of violence and strength. And then here we are, 3,500 years later, roughly. And that same, patch of land is being dominated by a group whose name means violence.
Yeah.
Still warring against the Israelites, so to
And
speak.
you have a terrorist group on the northern border in Lebanon, who, when we talked about that nation's part of that conspiracy from old to wipe Israel from the face of the earth, Tyr was included in on that.
Yeah.
Wow.
I had two questions, but I'm actually going to kind of combine these into one. and it's just kind of sneak peek into one of the chapters of your book that I found to be the most fascinating to me. Um, so last night I watched John Carpenter's Prince of Darkness with my buddy, and then there's this part of the movie where kind of the general plot is that Satan is trying to bring his father, the father of Satan, into our dimension. And I thought, oh, that's kind of interesting, huh? And then it reminded me of the movie Legend, where Tim Curry's character, Darkness, is trying to basically do the same thing with the unicorn horns. And he's trying to bring in, his father, the Lord of, the father of darkness. And all of a sudden it made me think like, okay, it makes no sense biblically, obviously, for there to be a father of Satan that is like the overlord of darkness. But I wonder, these are two movies that have something to do with that. Is there some sort of occult or Gnostic theory of the father of Satan being an overlord, father of darkness? And does that have anything to do with Hillel, the Lord of Hell, that you talk about in one of the chapters in your book?
Yeah, you don't really get that in polytheism. The best equivalent that might explain a little bit is you have in the Gnostic religion and the Greek accounts, you have Sophia, who marries with this nebulous life force of the universe to produce the 12 archons that they say God was part of and Satan was part of and is part of the equal 12. Maybe the two leaders would have been, God and Satan on that sort of creation, but it's a way of they put them on the same sort of level. So it might be a vague reference to that. And keep in mind, Sophia is something that we live with today as that mother goddess, as the philosophy, the love of Sophia, which is the theology of the world. And so when you look at, let's say, Isaiah 14, to get to your question about the father and connections, and also understand before I say that, when you look at the book of Enoch, there's Satan and then there's the Satans, right? So you have multiple, right? So, and that's just part of the hierarchy, but you have Ha-Satan, which is, Hillel, as he's understood in Isaiah 14, but you also have the king of Babylon that's in there. And people kind of think that that's like Satan is a Nephilim or Lucifer is a Nephilim there, and they start to conflate things. It's talking about two different things, because you never had a human or a Nephilim fall from heaven.
Mm-hmm.
Only Satan does. And we know it's Satan because
right.
Jesus tells us this in Luke 10:18. He saw Satan fall from heaven like lightning. I mean, so any of those fallen references and who are walking amongst the heavenly council, those are references to Satan. But you also have Hail Elp deriving another Hebrew word, even though it's not used anywhere in the Bible. It's Helel, and that's the king of Babylon, an antichrist type figure who would look at Satan in sort of a patronymic or patriarchal kind of way, right? And he would be trying all the way throughout to raise his throne to heaven, just like Satan tried to overtake heaven, and just as Antichrist does in the end time, as Daniel 8:10 during the war of heaven talks about. He actually throws some of the starry hosts down to the earth at that time. So you have to distinguish between the allegories of the king of Babylon and the Assyrian that also shows up in Isaiah 14. And you have an interesting kind of prophecy there, and I explain this throughout the book, in the new book, that it's a dual prophecy. And a dual prophecy has important information from prehistory, as with the fall of Satan and his rebellion. And you also have a prophecy for the period of the prophet, in this case, Isaiah. So in the Assyrian Empire, and the king of Babylon hasn't even come about yet, although you might take Babylon back to the original Antichrist figure, king of Babel, Nimrod, as sort of another aspect of that. But going forward, it's the Babylon Empire, and these are Antichrist wannabes.
Yeah.
And so you have details for the king of Babylon and Assyria that didn't happen in either of those two beast empires. And understand these are going to be talking about beast empires, Rephaim empires, who want to wipe humans from the face of the earth, and they want to set up their own realm with their pantheon of gods. And so you have details not fulfilled. So that's why I call it a dual prophecy, because it has Antichrist end time prophecies for the help of understanding. And so the two things are, is it's for that time, for the time of the end, and important prehistory information. So Ezekiel 28 is another one of those. And you have the Kairos, same sort of conflation there. Again, some of the things talked about Satan, they're like walking amongst
The fiery coals.
yeah, in heaven. I mean, humans don't do. And I
Yeah.
cover off Tyrus as well as Rephaim, and part of the commercial aspect of the beast empire. So that trading aspect, right? I
Yeah.
cover that off. So Hallel is this sort of allegorical son of Satan, just as Antichrist is thought to be the son of perdition and associated that sort of way. And that they're always going to try and present this Antichrist figure throughout time. They just can't get there to the end time. So there's lots of them, like Alexander, let's say Nebuchadnezzar. I could name more, but you sort of get the idea. So does that sort of give you an answer or a flavor to what you're asking?
That is awesome. Yes, absolutely.
And a whole bunch more in the new book on it.
It was way cooler than I thought it would be, as usual.
That was a great job.
And when I mentioned Ezekiel 32 before, that's a dual prophecy as well.
Okay, I got it written down here.
Yeah, and
Thank you.
Jonathan's question actually encapsulated my second question.
Oh, nice.
Yeah, because I was
Okay.
going to ask about Hallel.
Oh, cool.
Yeah.
Okay. Well, Gary, I know we're pressed for time. I think we have like just a few more minutes before we have to let you go. I want to do our. We got thrown a curveball by one of our patrons. He came in late with like 2 questions. I'm just gonna say you can answer whichever one of these you want. First one says, "Could this could be a yes or no question? Could current Israel events?" This is from Tim Sommer. Could current Israel events put forth the quote unquote Samson nuclear end of much of the Middle East?
Well, it's always that possibility. I don't think that happens yet. I think it could get messy. I think we're still in the sorrows. But if you wanted to sort of fast forward, how could you start bringing about some of these major catastrophes that would bring about the universal religion and end time Babylon, and the end time world government of 10 kings quickly? Something like that might do it. I'm not convinced we're quite there yet. You have to have Babylon come along. You have to have the false prophets come along. You have
Right.
to have more wars and rumors of wars for these kings to start, taking their empires. So yes, that's certainly possible. And we may even get something in a lesser degree that might happen more down the road, because the tribulations and the catastrophes and the sorrows get stronger as we go.
Yep, that is an excellent answer. And then his other one, I don't know if you could just briefly mention the names. He asks, "Who do you think is in the abyss as Apollyon and Abaddon?" I know we've kind of talked about this before. You just have some names for him.
Yeah. So when you go back to the book of Enoch, you have 2 names, which are Shemiyaza and Azazel. And they're both the leader of the Watchers. I think they're the same angel.
Yep.
Shem goes back to 2 words, as renowned or famous, infamous, and Shemaim, the heavenly ones. And so this may be one of the names of titles of Azazel. So Yaza is an Arabic and a Zen word for an angelic type of being. So it could have been corrupted by writings down the road to reflect that, because it doesn't end in EL, right?
Right.
And
it's the only
but
one.
it does
Yeah.
have Azazel in the last 3 letters, AZA. Just as Azazel comes out of Az and Azaz, which is all connected to the god of fortresses, goats, and all sorts of things that I don't have time to go into on its connections. So I think Azazel, Shemiyaza, as the same angel, is Abaddon and Apollyon, because this is the destroyer coming out and the chief of the angels. Just as we know, Azazel was put into the abyss as the leader of the fallen angels, of the watchers that committed the crimes before the flood. And that Azazel was the destroyer of the antediluvian world. He's the one who taught all the martial arts, all the arts of war, all the crafts that go with it. On the Day of Atonement, there's a second goat that's sacrificed that we're not given an explanation for. The first one is for the sins of Israel. The second one, we're not sure. I think it's for the sins of the antediluvian world. That word scapegoat is Hebrew Azazel. And I think it's for that's the connection there. So I think that's who the destroyer God is, who comes out of the abyss. And I think he's the one that helps with the destruction of Babylon, because you get the word abad as in destroying of Babylon in Jeremiah 51. And then you've got also connections of the son of perdition to Apollyon, as you take that back to Greek as the two different versions, and connections to Antichrist being called the son of perdition.
Man, nailed it.
That was great.
That was awesome. I know that was tough for you, Gary. I really appreciate the effort in making that just like the Cliff's Notes version. Thank you, because I know you're pressed for time. You got anything else, man?
No, brother, I'm good.
Gary, thank you so much for being with us. I know you've once again been super generous with your time. You've given us way more than we had scheduled for. So thank you as always. We're trying to get better at this, I promise. Just as we always do with the Goslings, before we say goodbye, do you have any words of wisdom for our audience so that they might go forth and strike down the darkness?
Yeah, learn more so that you can take on the people who are spreading misinformation, disinformation, who are trying to lead us headlong and cattle herd us into a world government, a world religion, perpetual war. They all have the same red flags about them. They're socialist, they're globalist, they're anti-Christian, I mean, you can go on and on and on. But if we're going to take them on and try and push it back, or probably if we can't push them back, to at least alert other people, we have to be able to communicate things in a way that makes sense to people. And they may not, instantly say, oh yeah, that's my aha moment. But maybe they'll start to think about things as they see more events come to pass. So the thing we can't do is lose our credibility. So we want to be a little more conservative, not get ahead of chronological events and prophecy. And yet we don't want to be too conservative so that we're not preparing people properly and we might miss some important things. So it's important to understand what is going on and how it relates to all of prophecy. Where people go wrong with prophecy is they try and read one passage or one chapter all alone, or try and reimagine it, and all the passages have to fit. And if they're reimagining it, or they're dismissing what Jesus said, or they're dismissing anything, or ignoring inconvenient passages, red flags. They have to make it fit. And that's the only way we're going to prepare people. And even when it comes to something like rapture, wherever you fit on it, my advice is, pray for pre-trib.
Prepare for post-trib.
Just prepare, right? Whether it's mid or post, but be prepared that, because you don't want it to have us lose our credibility or crush people's faith if it doesn't happen the way that you want.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah. And the way that we want is not necessarily the way that God has in mind. That's what faith and humility and wisdom are for.
Yep.
And being prepared with the sharp sword that is the Genesis 6 conspiracy.
Right.
Parts 1 and parts 2.
And now part 2.
Yeah, man.
Pre-order it.
Yeah, pre-order it on Amazon. Coming out in March. Gary, my friend, thank you so much once again. You're always
thank you. It was fun.
Honored.
It was fun.
Well, we'll get you back in the spring, I guess, to talk more. I got a question about that, though, that I want to ask you right after we're done recording, if it's okay, real quick.
Yeah.
All right, everyone.
Hey guys, if you're enjoying this conversation, you like this interview, and you want to hear some more of it, including some down and dirty stuff we're not allowed to say here on YouTube, head on over to patreon.com/the Goslings, sign up for one of our tiers, and enjoy some exclusive content.
That's right. And remember, keep it cool. And these are interviews
that strike down the darkness.
That's right, baby.
A vertical punch.